The EV industry has plenty of moving parts. The charging networks, the automakers, the charger manufacturers, the charger management systems, and the software systems involved that play into making this industry work. All of these bits must come together to create harmony and seamless interoperability at their many intersecting points. The question remains of how exactly we're going to get there. Welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast. I'm your host today, Francie, and I'm lucky enough to be joined by Janek Metzner from southern Germany, but who now finds himself on the Pacific coast of the U.S. in sunny California, where he holds the title of Head of North America at PIONIX GmbH, and also serves as a contributor to the Read Electric Avenue weekly newsletter. And I've had that song stuck in my head ever since I've been reading on your website. And you do other things as well. And your background includes your work at Lucid Motors on their charging and smart energy team. You also spent time with Faraday Future. And generally, you are sustained by a passion for e-mobility, sustainability, and clean energy solutions from all that I've read about you online and learned about you. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your work and diving into your thoughts about where the industry stands and where it's headed.
Thanks, Francie. Great to be on.
Great. Yes. And I want to start off by asking how you've gotten to where you are today. Of course, I gave a brief background of your resume credentials, but tell me a bit about yourself, your interests, and how your path in life has led you here.
Yeah, for sure. So like you mentioned, I'm originally from Germany. I studied industrial engineering. And when you live in southern Germany, where, BMW, Mercedes, Porsche, and all those companies are based, your interest naturally kind of flows in the direction of entering the automotive industry. So that's what I wanted to do. I did then have the opportunity to do an internship in the US at Bosch. And they sent me to CES in Vegas, a really big conference, the Consumer Electronics Show. And there I got to test drive the BMW i3 that had just been released, the first electric car of BMW. That was January of 2014. And it was my first time hearing, driving an electric car. And I was really excited about it. And I thought, wow, this is the future. I want to work in this area. And that's kind of how I got into the industry. So I came back to the US a year later to do my master's at UC Santa Barbara in California. And then I did an internship at Faraday Future down in LA.
Very cool. Yes, so you got behind the wheel of an EV and then things just blossomed from there. But you have a very interesting background that has, your technical expertise. And then it seems like your passion has really fallen here as well, which is, I love to see it, when that path just kind of unfolds before you. And I know I mentioned you are the head of North America for PIONIX, and I want to kind of have you tell us a bit of the story of how this came to be, because right now you stand as an open source software company. You provide embedded operating system to improve and unify electric vehicle charging infrastructure with the overall goal of being the answer to incompatibility between different charging systems for EVs, because we know there's a good bit of fragmentation in the market. And from what I know, like I said, the company has evolved over time. So can you tell me about the origin and then how PIONIX has gotten to where it is today?
Yeah, definitely. So the company is about 2 years old, a little over 2 years old now. And when I was at Lucid Motors, we brought a charging station to market, and I knew other companies and people in the industry bringing charging stations to market. And they always faced certain problems with interoperability, because you have X number of car companies, and then you have hundreds of manufacturers of charging stations globally, and everyone re-implements the same standards. So these standards, these communication protocols are really just PDF documents that you can purchase from ISO or SAE. And then you have engineers that read those documents and implement them in code. And everyone does it a little bit differently, because the standards are sometimes written in a vague way, or people misinterpret things or interpret things differently. Or sometimes there's already a car in the wild, which, let's say there's a 2013 Chevrolet Spark, where they implemented it in one way. And in order to support that car nowadays as a charger, you have to deviate from the standard. So then if a new car comes to market that follows the standards too strictly, it's not going to work with your charging station, because you tailor the charging station to work with X old car. So those are the nuances that create a lot of challenges, which is why car companies and charger companies go to these testing events and do testing with one another. And that's a lot of effort. It's logistical effort, it's time effort, it's engineering effort. And the idea of PIONIX is really to minimize the number of implementations that you have out in the field by having one implementation which is open source. So it's free to use for everyone, and the whole world, the whole community between like academia, research labs, and different manufacturers can contribute to it. They test it. And so by pooling the resources of the community, you can have one implementation which works very well and which also can move, add new features very rapidly.
Yes, I'd like to stick to this point for a second of how, we call them, it's standardization, but it's not interpreted the same way. And the difficulty here with the vagueness that exists and how it creates problems, like you highlighted. So can you paint a picture for me a little bit about what you understand of how this vagueness exists and how it could possibly be interpreted in different ways? Because if we're thinking about an emerging industry where we can be standardized, there's all these topics of standard connectors, standard, software behind it. How are we at the spot where we are, where there's not a unified approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the standards are like huge documents, and sometimes, even though there's editing and review processes and iterations, sometimes things get missed. So a standard might get published and there's something that's just not clearly defined, and it's a 250-page document and someone just missed it. And then they don't get revised for a while. It takes a couple of years to revise a standard. So sometimes those things only really get cleared up in the field by, people in the industry just kind of finding a consensus of how they deal with it. But then what happens is a new charger manufacturer wants to enter this market and they don't have all those industry connections. So they're not in on what the industry defined. So they need to figure that out. And it's hard to do.
It definitely is. I can see how, if it's requiring all this testing and background instead of being able to enter at the same level with the same information and understanding of that information, how it can cause folks to, be set back in their mission of, like you say, trying to be a provider in this space, but also that those existing have to interpret it. It reminds me of law. Like we interpret law, right? And there's precedents set, but it seems like with this kind of technology, we should, of course, be innovating and testing, but that starting from a uniform, like across the board understanding. So I think that's an interesting aspect that your work focuses on. And I want you to speak a little bit to going back to kind of how you're able to be where you are today. What are the main sources of funding or partnerships that have really been able to propel your work forward? Because, like you say, it's free and open source. So who do you find are your most important partners or funding sources that are making your work possible, and how exactly are they contributing?
Yep. Yeah, so I think it's important to distinguish between PIONIX, which is the company that I work for. It's a private for-profit company, and then EVerest. So EVerest is the open source project, that the software stack essentially that you can go online on GitHub and download it and find the documentation. And how they're related is PIONIX initiated EVerest. We made the initial code contributions, and we still do a lot of code contributions. But then exactly here you have the logo. EVerest is now an official project under the Linux Foundation, under the Linux Foundation Energy Division. So about a year into the existence of PIONIX, they partnered with Linux Foundation Energy to make this an official Linux Foundation open source project. So Linux Foundation has many projects in this energy space, and they looked at different candidates for an official project for the charging station software, and they ended up selecting EVerest, which was proposed by PIONIX. So we still, our developers contribute a lot of code to EVerest, but there are also other companies already that contribute code, and universities do research projects with it. Sometimes their developers contribute code. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, this the pool of contributors, which is kind of a theme in the work that you do, which is also a kind of not a vertical integration necessarily, because there are different CPO provider or charge point operators, but a again, a collaborative force. So, and it is great to, be distinct, where PIONIX and EVerest, which I like, are very different, and one is a project born of the other. So can you speak to this a little bit more? So how is this able to be, so you've pointed to the major issue here, that is there's not enough standardization. And in other words, many different implementations of the same communication protocols across the different providers in the industry. So how exactly can large charge point operators that exist approach this kind of solution? Because I do know that there are, they keep their cards close to their chest. They have individual efforts. There's not a ton of information sharing across the board because it is so competitive. So how can you really communicate this value proposition to them, especially when they have that, we're developing our own thing, we're remaining competitive in the market, and there's not always a ton of collaboration across the board?
Right. So our main target customer are the charger manufacturers, which then in turn sell to the charge point operators, or sometimes they're the same thing, like kind of in the case of ChargePoint. But generally, they already use a lot of open source software. So a lot of charging stations, the central control board, the computer inside is a Linux computer, which uses open source Linux software. But what in the past 10 years or so, these companies had to do is then make a make or buy decision. So they could either take these charging protocols and standards and give it to their in-house engineers and tell them, please implement this for us. And they would have, to figure that out. They would have to spend time. So the time to market is not that great, but you have more control. It's all in-house. The alternative was there are companies which provide commercial implementations of these standards as software stacks that you can run on your controller. So then your time to market is faster because you're just buying a solution, but you have less control because it's another company. It's often you don't get the source code, so it's a black box to you, and you also don't have much control. If you would like them to change something, there might be 10 other customers which are asking them to change something, and you're down in the line depending on how much money you spend with them. So the pitch of EVerest is that we can offer you the best of both worlds between make or buy. So in a way, the time to market is similar as with a make solution, with a buy solution, because you get the code right away. You can download it on GitHub, or you can ask us to help you integrate it on your hardware. So time to market is very fast, but you have the same level of control as if your engineers did it in-house, because you have access to the source code. And if the company that helps you integrate it on your hardware, like PIONIX, is ever too slow or too expensive or goes out of business, you can just ask your in-house developers or any external developers to take over the development and the code.
Very interesting. And hopefully that doesn't happen. But yeah, it makes me think of EVgo had their agreement with Delta to get a certain number of chargers manufactured. And then, of course, in that agreement, you can imagine that, well, if they have that kind of partnership, they're collaborating. But if you don't have that kind of partnership, then you're at a bit of a disadvantage. So I see where this can come in, where you can, you don't have to be waiting to be served if you need to implement something that is fixing a solution or improving what you're able to offer. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Who have been your can you speak to who have been some of the early adopters of your product, of EVerest, and how that has played out?
So we don't have any big name known customers that we can talk about publicly yet. I can say that we have very exciting customers in the pipeline, but we're only a 2.5-year-old company, and it takes, a year or 2 years to bring a charger to market traditionally. So, but I can say we have big automotive suppliers that have signed projects with us. We have companies from the solar space. We have car companies that want to bring charging stations to market. So as these become public, we will share the names of these customers. But so far there are no big chargers, known chargers in the market yet.
Sure, and totally understand. And can you speak a little bit with these, many early adopters that you've had? Have there been any lessons learned off the bat that you've already been able to improve on what you offer, or kind of see that, this is a way that we can better communicate what we do?
So something we do is, for example, if we notice that we test with all kinds of cars and all kinds of CPO cloud backend systems, and we publish on GitHub the list of cars that we test with. Sometimes we publish log files, and the same with the cloud backends. So if we find certain things, like if certain cars don't like certain behavior of the charging station, what we can do is we add a feature toggle. So then as a charging station manufacturer, or maybe as the operator, you can decide, do I want to be more standard compliant, which might enhance my compatibility with future cars coming to market, or do I want to support this specific car, which has this specific hiccup, and there's X number of them in the field. So those are some lessons that we learned, which we're now implementing.
That's really cool that you can kind of get a little customized with who you're catering to, because there are different issues based on different EVs, which is another moving part in this, where automakers have their different approaches, and we're seeing some, go, in a line. First, had the CCS alignment, and then now it's going to NACS and more, and we'll see how that is implemented and the hopeful uniformity that comes along, because again and again, yes, I think that the fragmented approaches create a bit of a more bumpy ride for people in the EV transition in any part of the industry. So that's one way that you're able to customize this service for customers. But I was reading on your website that, customers can approach you and say, this is exactly kind of what we're looking for. This is where we're coming from. So what other parts are you able to consider to best fit your product for their needs?
Yeah. So something we're also trying to do is, essentially our customers are the charging station manufacturers, and we're a tier 1 supplier to them, and there are other tier 1 suppliers kind of parallel to us. So these might be suppliers of payment terminals, of DC metering components, or of other like metrology chips, or these kinds of components. And normally charging station manufacturers would have to write their own drivers to make these components work with their charging stations. What we are trying to do is partner with these component manufacturers so that they provide drivers that work out of the box with EVerest, which then helps the charging station manufacturers get to market even faster, and makes them a preferred component. So we already have collaborations with companies like ChargeByte and Phytech, which provide these central controllers for charging stations, and you can buy controllers from them that come pre-installed with EVerest, and there's no software licensing fee for that. So you basically just pay for the hardware. So we focus just on this embedded software, the operating system that runs on the charger, but we think there should be open source solutions also in other parts of the value chain, for example, in the cloud backend for the charger. And we see now some coming to market. So that will be very helpful for operators or even for manufacturers of charging stations to have an open source, freely available backend to test against. And then on the other hand, the ecosystem approach is also that we use the power of the open source community. So I already mentioned this a little bit earlier, but universities or national research labs can also use the software for any kind of R&D testing, because oftentimes that's a problem today. If you're a university or a research lab and you apply for a government grant to demonstrate something, and you're not a charging station manufacturer yourself, then you often have to find some charging station manufacturer that does the project with you and does custom code changes for you to test those specific functions. And that can often be a hindrance, because those labs are approaching certain charging station manufacturers, and first they say yes, but then their priorities or resources shift around, then they pull out of the project. But with EVerest, for example, there are companies that sell you complete charger development kits where you can run EVerest out of the box. So we sell one at PIONIX called Belay Box. There are other companies like Seed Studio, which is a famous open source hardware company, which released a charger based on Beagle boards. So you can use those for your projects then. And
I want to kind of switch topics to something else that you are involved in, and that is the Electric Avenue newsletter and media coverage that you're a part of. So you're not only the head of North America at PIONIX, but you also take time to take part in this coverage of the industry. And I wanted to ask, why do you find being a part of this conversation in this way so important? Why do you find it important to step out and contribute to the coverage of what's going on?
Yeah. So I started this newsletter about a year ago, and I have a partner in Germany, Julius, who writes it together with me, and it's a weekly newsletter we've been writing for a year now. So what we do is we try to report things in the industry that we find are interesting. Sometimes we do deep dives. Sometimes we just curate links that we find interesting and give a little bit of opinion or analysis on them. And then we also try to make it entertaining. So we usually have like an electric meme of the week that we add as well. But in the beginning, it was just fun. It was a hobby that we did next to our regular jobs. But over time, we found that because we work in the industry ourselves and have been for like 5 to 7 years respectively, we can often see through the hype that is created in press releases, and we can also kind of give our opinion or see through that a little bit and give like an insider's perspective. So we tried to do that when all the news about NACS came out. We tried to do that with topics like bidirectional charging, and we found that really resonates with readers. And we also found that it sparked interesting discussions among people in the industry on LinkedIn and platforms like that.
Very cool. Yeah, there's a lot of noise out there, good and bad and neutral, and to be a part of it and be able to clarify things and, like you said, kind of see through whether it's, hyping up a story or kind of making estimates for how something's going to perform, but then knowing that, well, we haven't seen that actually analyzed and proven yet, and being able to communicate that, I do think that's very important. And it's also nice that this started kind of as a passion project, but it's grown to something that you find is not only very valuable to you and the work that you and your partner do, but also to other people. And one of the articles that shared on your site that definitely relates to today's conversation is why charging sucks and what to do about it. Because a lot of people, that's really what's keeping them out of the EV space, whether it's adopting it or even getting interested in it, is that there's a lot of news about charging infrastructure and why it's just not meeting the standards. So like you said, usually you go into, one topic in a bit of a deep dive, and maybe you address some other topics briefly, but you all did really dive into what you believe is standing in the way of a fully robust charging infrastructure. And folks can read this on the Electric Avenue website, of course, and we'll share the link and see how you specifically lay out your take on exactly why there are issues in this space that exists, from fragmentation to software competencies, the mix of suppliers that are integrated into the system, connector designs, and more. But you also highlight solutions, which I think is really important because, of course, there are problems and we can point to them. And that's really important. And what do we do with it?
Before I do that, I just want to give credit to the guest author that we had for that week. So that was Darren Howe from, he works at Cruise. He used to work at Tesla on the topic of charging. So we collaborated with him to republish an article that he had published prior. And Julius and I edited it slightly and added some of our own thoughts. But just want to make sure that that's recognized, that this was mainly Darren's article.
Definitely. We love to give credit where credit is due.
Exactly. So Darren starts with, first of all, train more technicians. Here he mentions specifically Charger Help, which is a company some of you may know that is really focusing on education and upskilling of people to enter this industry of charging station maintenance, which is going to need a lot of talent as we're building out these networks.
Definitely. I've seen a lot of initiatives too where there are scholarships for people moving into this space.
Yeah. And I believe some of the incentives now require technicians to have a certain charging specific training or certification, which on the one hand is good because it ensures that they're properly educated, but it also creates a little bit of a constraint or bottleneck of getting people and staff into the industry.
Okay. Understood. And then thirdly, I did see this point that was better connector suppliers.
Yep. So just a quick note on the second point, service providers in this context are the charging network operators. And then on the connectors, so the article was written before all this NACS transition happened. So Darren here called out that silly moving latch on the CCS1 connector, and people that work with these chargers will know that these latches do indeed break often, and the cables are very expensive to replace. So that's one of the main points that people really like about Tesla's connector, as well as about the CCS2 connector in Europe, that you don't have this moving latch, which can easily break.
And then this fourth point, the information sharing, this information sharing point, charger manufacturers should share charger logs and raw data streams more directly with service providers. And I see why this would definitely be a point to be made. And also, I think there's the fact that there's not always super transparent information sharing, because what do you think? Is that trying to keep the competitive edge? Is it just, this is our IP? What do you think?
Yeah, so there's a good example in the post there of how many different layers of organizations and component suppliers are involved on both sides, on the car and the charger side. You have so many parties, and that really oftentimes leads to this game of playing telephone, which is mentioned here. So it just needs to be, I think, a mindset for people that you should try to share as much data as possible, as we're all trying to figure out how to make the user experience better in this industry. And that's something that we're also trying to push inside of the EVerest project. Hence, we do publish on GitHub publicly available log files of tests that we did with different different cars and different charger backends.
You have this final point here, true partnerships among all players in the ecosystem. Have you seen examples of this kind of partnership amongst players that exist that you are saying, oh, that is a great example of what we should do, and that is a benchmark and we should meet it, or they're almost there?
EVerest is obviously one example, but a more well-known one is probably the OCPP and the OCPI protocols themselves, because they came out of initiatives of many players in the Dutch charging ecosystem, so charging network operators and utilities. They were very early with development of this industry in the Netherlands, and they had a lot of players, and eventually they realized, okay, that the Netherlands as a market itself was just too small for us, so let's create ways that we can be interoperable, to kind of have this rising tide that lifts all boats and make this market grow the whole pie, so to speak.
If folks were interested in getting in this place or following a similar path like you, do you have advice to them or a kind of a motivation that you would give to them?
Yeah, so for me, the motivation is really that I think we should transition our whole economy to being based on renewable energy. I just heard an interview with the Rivian CEO, I think the other week at the Code conference, and he mentioned how we had in like 75 years burned more than 50% of the global oil supply. So it's just not sustainable, right? We have to transition to other energy sources, and whether you want to support this because you want energy independence as a patriotic thing, or you want to support this because you're an environmentalist, I think we should all work on transitioning transportation away from carbon fuel sources.
I completely agree. You see what's happening to the world around us.
I think I also really enjoy the other benefits that come with EVs. So I personally drive a Kia Niro EV and have done so for 3 years. Before then, I drove an i3 in Munich. And it's great how little maintenance these cars need. It's amazing how quiet they are. So I think those are really big benefits too, because in the US, oftentimes you have highways going right through the middle of a city, and it just creates a lot of air pollution as well as noise pollution. So if you just imagine standing by a 5-lane highway in the middle of an American downtown, and it would all be EVs, imagine how much quieter it would be, how much better the air would be. So I think those are all really things to strive for as well.
Definitely. And that's a huge factor in my motivator, and I think a lot of also state, local, federal level to get EVs on the road is because there's also a disproportionate effect on disadvantaged communities, because those communities that usually live by the highways or that are worse affected globally are lower income communities, and that get an unfair distribution of the negative impacts. So definitely something to consider as well as just, a human on planet Earth. So I must agree. I really appreciate your how your passion has led you here, that you have not only a professional but a personal mission tied into this work. And I think that's key with people in this place. They're not just trying to make a great idea happen, but they're motivated from their core values.
Check out the newsletter if you want. The domain is readelectricavenue.com. If you do reply to the emails, we read every email. If you comment on LinkedIn, we check that out as well. So very easy to get in touch with us. And then maybe we can add in the show notes also some links to EVerest. There's a public mailing list hosted by the Linux Foundation. So even if you're not yet in the industry and you're just interested in following along, there are public calls you can join. There's this email list that you can follow along. So because it's open source, it's all very approachable and neutral out in public. So we can add those links maybe in the show notes. Yes,
perfect. We'll definitely add all the links so folks will be able to look into the description and head there and definitely sign up for the newsletter. It's great. I do really appreciate your work, and I like the little bit of fun that you throw in there with the GIFs and but also you write in a very I like how you write and engage people in what you're doing. So thank you again for coming on to the podcast. I really appreciate your time. It's really interesting to learn about your work and your approach in general to collaboration in this space and openness, right? There's a lot of walls, but there's also a lot of fragmentation that needs to be connected to really succeed in this space. So we'll see how it evolves over time. But yeah, thank you for your time. And I hope to keep track of what you do and maybe one day have you back on if you have some interesting news that we'd like to cover.
Sounds good. Thank you, Francie. Great to be on.
See you next time on the Out of Spec podcast.